Live from New York, this is the Sports Sit-Down.
Mike Damergis along with Dom Amore from the Hartford Courant. And Dom, you covered the Yankees for well over a decade, writing for the Courant and everything. And the revival of Baseball Magazine, I want to show everybody here, has been sensational. And the latest article about Babe Ruth's last game you wrote, and well, I just cut through it like a hot knife through butter. And the pictures are sensational.
Yeah.
Baseball Digest has that access, and the article is great about you kind of took the angle that Babe Ruth should have ended his career on the day he hit 3 home runs playing for the Braves.
Mhm.
Tell me about your research for it and tell me, why you thought you need to write the article.
Well, Rick Cerrone, of course, is the editor in chief of the magazine, and he's done just a fabulous job with it. And he and I both like, early baseball history. So I guess I'm kind of the designated guy for those kinds of stories when he gets a brainstorm. And he and I kind of talked about this. It was 90 years ago, and Rick, by the way, is a real buff of baseball movies. You may not know it, but he was a consultant on The Natural when that was made. So he really he knew that the two movies written about Babe Ruth were actually way off with their details. And I think both of them basically had him retiring after the 3 home run game in Pittsburgh, but he
Yeah.
didn't.
The
And
one
so
with John,
he wanted a factual thing on that.
yeah, the one with John Goodman was terrible, the
Yeah,
movie.
yeah. They had him spitting blood and all that. It was a little ridiculous, but yeah. And I said this at that time, and even earlier when I watched the William Bendix movie. Babe Ruth's career and his life was so Hollywood that if you did it 100% factually, it would still be a great movie. There's no need to embellish anything about his life or career because it was that much of a great American story and that much of a rags to riches story and that much of a legend. So I was always kind of disappointed that they could have stuck completely to the facts and it would have been a great movie.
Well, how it would have ended, like you wrote in your piece, was on the day with the Braves, he hit 3 home runs and there were monster shots. The last one,
Yeah.
he should have ended his career on that day. You point out.
Yeah, he had again, according to his memoirs and many of the many great books, of course, have been written about Babe Ruth. The most famous being Robert Kramer's book from 1974. But he had made an agreement with the owner of the Braves, Emil Fuchs, who he did not like, did not get along with, that he was going to retire sooner than later. And they really wanted him to finish that road trip because there were big ceremonies planned in a lot of different cities. Um, and so he went ahead and played a few more games after that. But his wife, Claire, and some of his friends had urged him after that 3 home run game, don't play anymore. Don't just if you're going to retire right now. And but he did he fulfilled his agreement with Fuchs and played a handful of games more. And Robert Kramer wrote in his book his career ended not with a bang in Pittsburgh, but with a whimper in Philadelphia because he that was actually the last hit that he got.
I actually watched Lou Gehrig movie uh, for a couple of years ago, and Babe Ruth actually was in the movie about
Yes.
Lou Gehrig's life, starring Gary Cooper prior to the Yankees. And the thing I was fascinated was how the writers traveled with the team on the
Mm.
trains,
Yeah.
and so they got to see the hijinks of the players in between.
Yes.
And a lot of stuff was kept under covers. Now
Yeah.
you covered the Yankees for 11 years. You didn't have that quite access of that they had then, but talk about it was a give and take because Ruth sold papers for the
Oh,
New
sure.
York writers and the companies.
Well, in those days, the unspoken agreement was that if writers are going to be on the train or going to travel, that they would keep the private stuff private. So there was a lot of stuff going on, mostly with drinking. and card playing and fights, because these were rowdy, a lot of these were rowdy country guys playing ball at that time. So the writers saw a lot of these things, and and some legends grew out of that. Like, it was written somewhere and somehow it became a thing that Babe Ruth actually hung Miller Huggins out of the off the platform of a speeding train by his ankles and pulled him back in. That never happened, but that became a legend, and people expounded on it. Leo DeRocha wrote about it in his memoirs as if it really happened. He didn't witness it. So there are a lot of things, but the unspoken agreement was, if you're going to write embarrassing things about the players, then you're not going to be on the plane. You're not going to be on the train. So the writers more or less, yeah, they did keep a lot of that stuff undercover. Later on in the 70s, when more of the new journalism kind of was fashionable, the writers wouldn't necessarily keep to that. They wrote about what they saw on planes when they were now traveling by plane. And very famously, a lot of the Billy Martin stories came from writers being at the team hotel or being on the plane and seeing his behavior behind the scenes. So that started to get phased out. And teams then, writers obviously aren't allowed anywhere near the team plane today. And that's the reason for that, because those unspoken agreements disappeared. So now writers don't. You're right. We don't have anywhere near that kind of access, and we have far less today than we had even when I was covering the team 15 or so years ago.
Yeah, certainly Reggie and Munson and Billy, it was at heyday of it. The 90s Yankees seemed benign, and now today's Yankees are probably
Yeah.
even more benign because everybody has their cell phones and their earbuds and are kind of aloof. Talk about Ruth. He was a carouser, he was a gambler, he was a drinker, he was a partier, but he had a heart for kids, and he
Yeah.
always made time for kids, as you pointed out.
Yeah, loved kids all the way to the end of his life. There are a lot of great stories about that. Um, but right there on the day he was in one of the Pittsburgh papers that day. Um, keep in mind, in the days when there was no interleague play, uh, Pittsburgh Babe Ruth had never played in Pittsburgh before. He'd never been in the National League, so he never played in Pittsburgh, never played in Cincinnati. Um, it never whatever the cities that didn't have two teams. So when he arrived in Pittsburgh, really for the first time in a regular season game, a big deal was made of it, even though he was obviously slumping. And yeah, he'd gotten a letter from a woman who had a sick child and wanted an autographed ball, and he made sure that and she was willing to pay for the postage to send it, and he of course wanted none of that. He signed the ball, made sure, and he made time for kids even that morning at Forbes Field in the clubhouse.
Because you wrote a book a few years back about the history of the New York Yankees, and Ruth is certainly a significant figure in turning
Mhm.
the Yankee franchise around. What tell me something that the average public doesn't know something about Babe Ruth, whether funny story, serious story. We know about eating hot dogs during games and having a bellyache and not playing, because he might have a bellyache and car accidents, getting with hitting a train. I think
Yeah.
there is this whole, like you said, you can't make this up, and
Yeah.
especially back then, it was really unbelievable.
Yeah, there was a pitcher by the name of Hub Pruitt with the St. Louis Browns, who was a very average or less than average, below average major league pitcher. But he's a left-hander, and he had Babe Ruth's number. And he struck him out something like uh, 10 out of 12 times that he faced him. He was far and away the most successful pitcher ever against Babe Ruth. Babe Ruth might have gotten a hit or two, maybe even a home run, but he struck out nearly every time he faced him. And ultimately, the pitcher didn't last long in baseball, and he went on to medical school and became a doctor. And he met Ruth very late in life, maybe after Ruth retired, and told him, you put me through medical school, all the notoriety and the little money that I made in baseball, I made because of my reputation of striking you out all the time. And, you put me through medical school. So I want to thank you. Thank you. And Ruth, didn't even remember him because Ruth was terrible with names. And he said, well, I don't remember you, but if I put you through medical school, I'm glad of it. Again, also, it was that Ruth was very bad with names, called everybody kid.
Kid, yeah, that's right.
And with Yogi Berra was kind of like that too. But when Wade Hoyt, who was had been his teammate for more than 10 years, was traded away, Ruth shook his hand and said, well, good luck, Walter. He didn't, he always gets his name wrong. So there's a lot of there are a lot of stories about him being kind of a savant, hardly an intellectual, hardly maybe not even by most standards, even an intelligent guy, but he had this savant-like knowledge of baseball and this incredible awareness of his marketability and what that could do for him and what that should be doing for him. That was far ahead of his time. The idea of an athlete being a celebrity, I believe, was born with Babe Ruth. What other athletes became later, in terms of their celebrity, started with Babe Ruth making himself a cultural as well as a baseball icon.
Michael Jordan, certainly an icon in that somewhat of the same vein, but Michael Jordan makes money because he has a Jordan brand. Who's making all the money that Babe Ruth of the Babe Ruth brand?
Well, he does have an estate, with his descendants. And I know I don't know all the details, Mike, to be honest, but they do fight over it occasionally in court. I have fought over some of it in court, but the proceeds are supposed to, there are supposed to be royalties paid when you use his name to the Babe Ruth estate, much like the same with Vince Lombardi. You buy something with Vince Lombardi on it, his estate gets a piece of the action there. So that's basically I believe the way it goes.
Yeah, I was actually just throwing that out blindly, thinking Major League Baseball, of course, is a beneficiary of Babe Ruth, and they are, because just you say Major League Baseball, the attention goes to them when you mention Babe Ruth and the home run record.
Yeah, I'm sure they license things and get their cut.
Ruth and Gehrig always didn't get along. What can you share about that relationship with Ruth and Gehrig? Ruth being flamboyant and Gehrig being the humble son of German.
That's exactly kind of the way it came down. There's a picture when the Yankees first signed Lou Gehrig right out of Columbia. They brought him to Yankee Stadium, and he actually played in the majors a handful of games in June of 23. So Gehrig was only about 19 or just turned 20. And there's a picture of he and Ruth talking. And of course, Gehrig had idolized Ruth because Ruth was already the biggest star in the game and a left-handed hitter and all of those things. But Gehrig went down to the minors, and of course, he came back later. As Leo DeRocher always pointed out, Gehrig was a very quiet guy. He played bridge and smoked a pipe in the clubhouse, didn't gamble, didn't do any of those things. Whereas Ruth was obviously very flamboyant. But they did get along through the 20s and 30s. But ultimately, they kind of drifted apart because they were far apart in age and very different in personality. And when they went on a trip to Japan, where they really, actually before that, Ruth wanted to hold out with Gehrig jointly for more money. He wanted them to hold out together for leverage against the Yankees and to get more money. And Gehrig didn't want to do that. He just signed. Gehrig was very underpaid throughout his career. And so Gehrig just didn't want to do that. So Ruth really resented him after that, thought he was a kind of didn't have the courage to stand up for himself and get the money that he deserved. And then they got into a feud over the when they went on the trip to Japan. That was near the end of Ruth's career. I think that was 34. So, and it was the same type of thing. Gehrig was very close to his parents. Ruth's second wife was very had a lot of control over him that his first wife, of course, didn't. And so Gehrig's parents didn't get along with Ruth's wife, and there was a lot of issues there. But Claire Ruth once said that, I know the Babe looks silly giving a $10 tip when 50 cents would be generous, but Lou's dimes were just as silly. So Ruth was this flamboyant big tipper, and then Gehrig was very penurious, and of course he didn't make as much money as he should have been. So there was some natural, they were just very different people. But ultimately afterward, and of course Ruth appeared in the movie. There was a reason for that. And he was at the Gehrig speech. They kind of patched things up there.
And Ruth actually's acting was pretty well in that movie. Prior to
Yeah, interestingly, in the Goodman movie, there was a thing where Ruth would tell Gehrig, "Don't you dare hit home runs in the right field stands. That's my territory." And I remember watching that, saying, "Oh, that's ridiculous." Ruth wouldn't say anything that stupid, even kidding around. But apparently he did. Apparently, to try to intimidate a younger Gehrig, he'd say, "Stay out of the right field stands, son." So apparently that there was actually truth to that, which I couldn't fathom that was true.
almost 100 years since Ruth's last game.
Mhm.
Several players since he retired have passed him. Hank Aaron, legitimately. Barry Bonds, steroids, asterisk, 762. Now Josh Gibson's mark as well. He sits at fourth place. How do we look at Babe Ruth's record almost 100 years after his retirement?
Well, I think you have to look at it on two levels. The first level is the game was very different when he played. I doubt if he ever saw a 100-mile-an-hour fastball. Even if he did, maybe Walter Johnson threw that hard, but I doubt even that. So he probably never saw a 100-mile-an-hour fastball, and he saw a lot of pitches. There were a lot of knuckleballers then, which if you saw that all the time, it was hittable. And a lot of pitchers would throw a roundhouse curve, which was just a big blooper pitch. That was their changeup. And so you see a lot of film of Ruth, stepping up in the box and almost winding up to hit the ball, which kind of tells you that the ball's not coming 95 miles an hour. So, and of course, now ballparks were much bigger in the power alleys, many like Yankee Stadium and the Polo Grounds, much shorter down the lines. So the game was very different then. And of course, although he was very, very big at the time he played, he would look like a smaller than average player today. If Babe Ruth stood next to Aaron Judge, you wouldn't believe they played the same sport. So he probably couldn't achieve those kinds of numbers if he played in the modern era. Particularly since he wasn't always in shape. He'd have to stay in shape year round to play Major League Ball today. However, you can only judge somebody by what they do against their era. What do they do while they're playing against the competition they're facing? And no player ever dominated the competition of his time the way Babe Ruth did. As he hit more home runs than every other team in the American League the year he hit 60. He was hitting in the 50s when nobody else was even hitting 10. So on that level, and of course he was also a 342 lifetime hitter. 342, okay? Tremendous on-base percentage, tremendous slugging percentage. So, and he was also not, by the way, probably would have won at least one Cy Young Award as a pitcher if that award existed. So it's hard to consider anybody else the greatest player of all time. And when you talk about home runs, the only player that has come close to him in terms of home runs per at bats is Aaron Judge. Aaron Judge averages well over 50 home runs per 162 games, and Babe Ruth's the only one who was close to that. So I would consider him the greatest baseball player of all time, taking all the levels into consideration. That doesn't mean he could do what he did in the 20s if he played in the 2020s, but he dominated his competition more than anyone else who's ever played.
I guess the only other comparison might be like Jim Brown, the great running back for Cleveland.
Mm,
Um, Defenses weren't back then what they are today,
right.
going against maybe smaller players, and um, the competition wasn't as fierce. But like you said, you can only go against who you're taking the field.
Right. I mean, the Green Bay Packers averaged 250 pounds per offensive lineman. They would get crumpled by even a bad NFL team today. It's fact of life. But that doesn't mean they weren't the greatest team ever assembled because of the way they played together against the teams that they played in the 1960s.
Well, Dom, great article, great magazine. All you fans out there, Baseball Digest is back. I have the old copies actually, right in the corner here. I'll
Yeah, I did too. The small ones, I used to get them.
and it's a Pee Wee Reese there, the old Baseball Digest.
Duke Snyder, yeah.
Oh, that's Duke Snyder.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, it was the magazine is the oldest continuously published baseball magazine in existence. It's been continuously, it never went anywhere. It's been continuously published since 1942. And I remember I used to subscribe to it in the 70s. It was a very small magazine, but it was packed with great stuff.
Yeah, great stuff.
And Rick, when he took over, reimagined it maybe 8 or 9 years ago. He kept uh, a lot of the weekly or month features that were in that small version of it. He's kept those, but he's also added a lot of things, and he knows everyone, so he gets the best writers in the country. I'm excluding myself from that, but he gets some of the best baseball writers out there to write great stories for him on everything. So if you haven't seen one lately, and you run into one in a Barnes and Noble or at a place that sells magazines, pick one up if you like baseball. There's always going to be something in there, past or present, that you're going to like.